Think about this. A conflict that seems so present, so now, often has roots stretching back hundreds, even thousands of years.
Exactly. What we see today is often just the latest expression of much older stories.
And today, we want to try and unravel some of those threads connecting Russia and Ukraine. We're looking at the history, the narratives that shape their relationship right now.
We've been drawing on quite a bit of historical analysis, notably Orlando Fidge's book, The Story of Russia. It offers some really deep insights.
Yeah, and we also found some really interesting perspectives in materials from Mindful Moments. That's a YouTube channel using AI for book analysis. It sparked some good reflection, which is useful for tangled histories like this one.
Definitely helpful for navigating these complex topics.
So let's start with those foundational stories. We often hear President Putin's perspective on Ukraine, that it's not really a separate country. Where does that view come from, historically speaking?
Well, it's this idea of Ukraine as historically part of a greater Russia, a borderland, essentially, shielding Moscow from the West.
Right? The Malorossi idea, Little Russia.
Precisely. And this isn't just, a modern political talking point. It's framed as this imperial logic with deep roots, used to justify actions like annexing Crimea and, well, the current war.
So it's more than just one person's view. It's tapping into a pre-existing narrative.
Exactly. It's a narrative that's been cultivated and adapted over time.
And it seems like history itself is maybe more central in Russian political discussion than in some other places. Why is that?
That's a key point. In systems where, let's say, open political or ideological debate is maybe less common, history often steps in to fill that space. Myths about the past, foundation stories, they become really important tools for bolstering authority, for legitimizing the current regime. Some argue Russia's very identity is kind of held together by these historical narratives that get reshaped and reused again and again.
Interesting. So what are some of those core myths we see being invoked?
A really central one traces Moscow's lineage directly back to Kievan Rus and even further to the Byzantine Empire. Figures like Prince Vladimir, the one who adopted Christianity, are often portrayed as like the first Russian czar, this holy figure who gathered the Russian lands.
Creating this sense of an unbroken sacred line of succession.
Precisely. And this myth was incredibly useful, for example, for the Romanov dynasty later on. They didn't have a direct bloodline back to the Kievan princes.
Right.
So they leaned heavily on this idea of inheriting the mantle, inheriting the history, which included, of course, Ukraine. It helped legitimize their rule over those territories.
But looking back at Kievan Rus itself, it wasn't quite this purely Russian Orthodox entity that the later myths suggest, was it?
No, not at all, really. Early Kievan Rus, the historical reality, was much more complex. It was quite open, influenced by all sorts of groups: Khazars, Vikings, Byzantines, Europeans, even the Ottomans later on.
A real crossroads.
Absolutely. Defined by trade routes, connections, quite different from the more inward-looking image sometimes presented.
So, thinking about Russia's expansion over the centuries, is it always seen as purely aggressive imperialism? Or is there another perspective?
Well, that's a classic debate among historians, isn't it? Is Russia inherently expansionist? Or is its outward movement more of a defensive reaction? Trying to secure borders on the vast open steppe, needing buffer zones.
Both sides have evidence, I suppose.
They do. And understanding both arguments gives you a fuller picture. It's probably not just one or the other.
And the nature of the Russian state itself, that played a role too. You mentioned this patrimonial autocracy. How did that work?
Right. So unlike, say, absolutist monarchies in Western Europe, the Russian state developed differently. The czar wasn't just the head of state. The realm was seen almost as his personal property, his patrimony.
Like he owned it personally.
In a sense, yes. And this was reinforced by the idea of the czar's authority being sacred, a legacy from Byzantium, a holy ruler.
Which sounds like a source of strength.
It was immense strength, but also a weakness, paradoxically, because if the czar was seen to betray that sacred trust, or if someone else could claim that mantle,
then rebellion could also be justified using the same logic, a false czar.
Exactly. And this intense focus on the czar's personal sacred power perhaps limited the development of other power centers, like a strong independent aristocracy or robust civil society compared to Western Europe.
Okay, let's shift to the people themselves. This idea of a single ancient Russian ethnos. How accurate is that?
Not very accurate, historically speaking. The idea of some primeval, pure Russian ethnicity doesn't really hold up. The early populations in that vast area were really complex mixes.
Formed over long periods.
Centuries of migrations, interactions. Russia doesn't have many hard natural boundaries, does it? So people moved in from Europe, from Asia. Ethnos, meaning shared culture and language, developed gradually from these diverse roots.
Even the sort of standard story, the Slavs moving north, there's more to it.
Yeah, the traditional narrative is Slavs pushed north by Turkic groups, developing this hardy, collective peasant culture. That's part of it. But the Vikings, or Varangians, were hugely important too.
For trade, mainly.
Primarily trade, yes. Setting up routes along the rivers connecting Scandinavia down to Byzantium in the east. In fact, the name Rus itself probably comes from an Old Norse word related to rowing.
Really? So the name might actually come from these Viking traders?
It's a strong possibility, which is fascinating, isn't it?
It is. And what about influences from the East, from Asia? Sometimes that gets downplayed.
It does. There's sometimes been a sensitivity about acknowledging Asiatic influences. But history shows long periods of, peaceful coexistence, trade, intermarriage between the early Slavs and various steppe peoples like Turkic and Finnic groups.
Not just conflict, then?
Not at all. Rus elites even adopted styles of dress, status symbols from the steppe cultures. It's a really interwoven history. Understanding these complex historical threads is something we also explore in other discussions, and resources like Mindful Moments and related podcasts can offer further avenues for thoughtful analysis.
That connection to Byzantium you mentioned earlier, that seems absolutely fundamental.
Oh, hugely. Byzantium, Constantinople was like the spiritual capital, much as Rome was for the Latin West.
Connecting Russia to a wider Orthodox world.
Exactly. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece.
Yeah.
And this idea of Holy Russia emerges from that connection, Russia as a new center of true faith, a land of salvation after Byzantium fell.
And we see it in the art, the icons.
Definitely. Russian icon painting starts with Byzantine models, but develops its own very distinct, powerful style. And there's also this particular Russian tendency, maybe stronger than elsewhere, to sacralize power itself, to make saints out of rulers.
But did Christianity take hold quickly and uniformly?
No, it was actually quite a slow process in Kievan Rus. For a long time, you had this syncretism, a blending of older pagan beliefs and practices with the new Christian ones, especially in popular religion.
So thinking about Kievan Rus again, how direct is the line from it to modern Russia? You mentioned the Romanovs used the myth, but is it the true foundation?
It's debatable. Certainly the roots of Russian Orthodoxy, language, some artistic forms are there in Kievan Rus. But politically, Kievan Rus had different structures, potentially more power for an aristocracy, even elements of democracy in the town assemblies, the Vesh.
Things that didn't necessarily continue in Muscovy later.
Right. Much of that specific Kievan heritage was transformed or lost over the centuries, especially after the next big event.
The Mongol invasion.
The Mongol invasion. Mid-13th century, that was a seismic shock, the establishment of the Golden Horde's dominance over the Russian principalities.
What did that actually mean on the ground?
It meant Russian princes had to travel to the Horde's capital, Sarai, to pledge allegiance, to get the Khan's authorization, the Yarlik, to rule. It meant devastating raids if tribute wasn't paid or if there was resistance.
A period of submission?
Yes, but complex. Figures like Alexander Nevsky, for example. He's celebrated as a national hero for defeating the Teutonic Knights, but he was also quite a loyal servant of the Mongols, working with them.
And you mentioned the church actually thrived.
Paradoxically, yes. The Mongols generally didn't interfere much with the church. They even granted it tax exemptions. So the church's influence and land holdings actually grew significantly during this period. And Moscow started its rise partly because it was a reliable tribute collector for the Horde, developing trade under their sort of distant protection.
And this is where that idea of Russia as a shield comes from, protecting Europe.
That national myth really gets traction here. The idea that Russia absorbed the Mongol blow, saving Europe from the Asiatic hordes. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380 is often presented as the key moment.
But it didn't actually end Mongol rule right away.
No, not at all. Kulikovo was an important victory, psychologically, but the Horde retaliated, sacked Moscow again just 2 years later. Mongol influence lingered for another century.
Still, the seeds of Muscovite power were sown.
Absolutely. And there were lasting influences too, linguistic, administrative practices, maybe even, some argue controversially, things that reinforced autocratic tendencies or laid groundwork for serfdom later. It definitely strengthened the state's hand in things like taxation, demanding collective responsibility.
Which leads us to the rise of Moscow as the dominant center. How did it justify its claim to leadership?
Well, as Mongol power waned and Byzantium fell to the Ottomans in 1453, Moscow began positioning itself ideologically.
The Third Rome concept.
Exactly. The idea that Moscow was the legitimate successor to Rome and Byzantium, the last bastion of true orthodoxy. They developed myths, like the one about receiving the cap of Monomach from a Byzantine emperor, to bolster this claim. They even created genealogies tracing the Moscow princes back to Roman emperors.
Really building that sacred image.
Intensely. It culminated with Ivan V formally taking the title of Tsar Caesar in 1547. That was a huge statement, elevating Moscow's status on the world stage. And the early czars worked hard to consolidate power, bringing the church firmly under state control.
Ivan V, the Terrible. His reign seems pivotal.
It was huge consolidation of power. The building of the Kremlin is this massive symbol, but also incredible brutality. While European monarchs were also centralizing power, Russian autocracy, with those Mongol legacies and the patrimonial idea, developed differently. Less restraint, perhaps?
A stronger state relative to society.
Arguably, yes, an imbalance. Ivan reformed administration, law, the military, all to centralize control. But the boyar assemblies, unlike parliaments in Europe, had very limited power to check the Tsar. And this was also a period of expansion, particularly eastward into Siberia.
Urmak's conquest.
Right. But Ivan's legacy is deeply ambiguous. Seen initially as successful, but his later paranoia, the Oprichnina terror. That's where the terrible moniker comes from. Even Stalin later tried to rehabilitate his image somewhat.
And his death led to chaos.
Yes, the time of troubles. Dynastic crisis, civil war, foreign invasion. A really bleak period. Only resolved when the Romanov dynasty was established in 1613. But even then, the underlying tensions about the Tsar's legitimacy, the potential for false Tsars, didn't just disappear.
So the early Romanovs inherited a shaky situation.
Very shaky. Mikhail Romanov's election was a compromise. There was still social unrest, Cossack raids on the frontiers. Under Tsar Alexei, Mikhail's son, you had major uprisings like the Moscow riot in 1648. People believed the Tsar had a duty to protect them from corrupt officials and nobles.
And this is when serfdom becomes fully entrenched.
Yes, the law code of 1649 effectively bound peasants permanently to the land. It was partly a response to the demands of the landowning service class needing a stable labor force, but it fueled resentment, leading to huge rebellions like the one led by Stenka Razin, brutally crushed, of course.
Alongside this social turmoil, there were religious upheavals too, the church schism.
Right, mid-17th century. Reforms were introduced to liturgical texts and rituals, partly to align with Greek practices after Russia acquired parts of Ukraine, but many Russians resisted fiercely.
The Old Believers.
The Old Believers, yes. They saw the reforms as heresy, a betrayal of holy Russia. It created a deep, lasting split in Russian society and religious life.
And then comes Peter the Great, who takes things in a totally different direction.
Completely different. Peter was almost contemptuous of old Muscovy. He wanted to modernize, westernize, especially the military, to compete with powers like Sweden.
His travels to Europe, learning shipbuilding.
Hands-on, yes. He fought the Great Northern War against Sweden, won access to the Baltic, and built St. Petersburg as his window on Europe. A deliberate break with Moscow.
And he tried to force Western culture on the elite.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Shaving beards, adopting Western dress, manners. It was a cultural revolution imposed from above. But many, especially later Slavophiles, saw it as a betrayal of Russia's unique spiritual path, creating a gulf between the westernized elite and the traditional populace.
A paradox. Modernization driven by the state, but without creating a free society.
Exactly. It strengthened the state, the military, but deepened the divide between the state and the people. That's a recurring theme, isn't it?
Moving into the 18th century, after Peter, we see Catherine the Great, also a westernizer in some ways.
Yes, Catherine, herself a German princess who seized power in a coup, cultivated an image as an enlightened monarch. She corresponded with Voltaire, encouraged European immigration except for Jews, notably.
And continued the expansion.
Oh, yes. Big expansion southwards, including the final annexation of Crimea from the Ottoman sphere. But her enlightenment had limits. When faced with radical critique, like Radishev's description of serfdom, she cracked down hard. Autocracy remained supreme.
Then the Napoleonic Wars shake things up again.
Hugely. Alexander initially flirted with liberal reforms, but the invasion by Napoleon in 1812 changed everything.
The Patriotic War.
The Patriotic War. Its victory cemented this powerful narrative of Russia as the savior of Europe, sacrificing itself to defeat the godless French. It boosted national pride immensely, but also led Alexander towards mysticism and conservatism.
And after him,
His death sparked the Decembrist revolt by reform-minded officers, which was crushed by his successor, Nicholas I. Nicholas's reign was deeply reactionary, defined by orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. This is where Slavophile ideology, emphasizing Russia's spiritual superiority to a decadent West, really flourished.
but critical voices still emerged.
Yes, the intelligentsia thinkers and writers who began critically examining Russian society, serfdom, the autocracy. Think of the great realist novelists.
Then came another shock, the Crimean War.
A disaster for Russia, defeated on its own territory by Britain and France. It shattered the myth of Russia's invincible military might and the whole Holy Russia idea.
And that spurred reform.
It forced the hand of Alexander II. The realization that Russia was technologically and socially backward led directly to the Great Reforms, most famously the emancipation of the serfs in 1861.
A huge moment, but complicated.
Very complicated. The terms weren't always favorable to the peasants. They had to pay for the land. It didn't solve the underlying agrarian problems. But other reforms, like local self-government bodies, Zemstvos, opened up possibilities.
And new radical ideas were spreading. Populism.
Yes, the populist Narodniks, who believed the peasants held the key to Russia's future, tried going to the people. Some turned to terrorism.
Leading to Alexander II's assassination.
Exactly, which brought his son, Alexander III, to the throne, ushering in another period of reaction, clamping down on dissent, Russification policies. But underground, Marxist ideas were starting to take root among revolutionaries.
Setting the stage for the final czar, Nicholas II.
And a period of mounting crises. Defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, growing worker unrest, peasant demands. Lenin's Bolshevik faction was arguing for a disciplined, secret party to seize power.
The 1905 revolution.
Triggered by Bloody Sunday. It forced Nicholas to concede a parliament, the Duma, but he constantly undermined its power. Stolypin's reforms tried to create a class of conservative peasant landowners, but it was too little, too late for many.
And then World War I.
The final catastrophe for the Tsarist regime. Military defeats, economic collapse, horrific casualties. It broke the back of the system.
Leading to February 1917.
The Tsar abdicates. A provisional government takes over, but it's weak. Power is also flowing to the Soviets, the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils, where the Bolsheviks are gaining influence with promises of peace, land, and bread.
And then, October 1917.
The Bolsheviks seize power in Petrograd, the start of a whole new era.
An era of civil war and immense upheaval.
Absolutely. Years of brutal civil war followed, Reds versus Whites, foreign intervention. The Bolsheviks eventually won, but at a terrible cost. War communism devastated the economy.
Peasant uprisings, too.
Major ones, against grain requisitioning. This forced Lenin to adopt the new economic policy, the NEP, allowing some private trade to stabilize things.
But debates continued within the party.
Fierce debates about the NEP, about whether socialism could be built in Russia alone or if world revolution was needed. This was the backdrop for Stalin's rise.
How did he consolidate power?
Through meticulous control of the party bureaucracy, the appointments, and crucially, the political police. He outmaneuvered rivals like Trotsky. Even Lenin, in his last writings, expressed alarm about Stalin's concentration of power and his Great Russian chauvinism.
Interesting, that phrase coming from Lenin.
Yes. After Lenin's death, Stalin skillfully used the cult of Lenin, the mausoleum, the ideology to legitimize his own rule.
Leading into the Stalinist period proper.
Which meant the end of the NEP, forced collectivization of agriculture, a brutal campaign against the peasantry, especially the so-called kulaks, leading to horrific famine, particularly in Ukraine, the Holodomor.
And the 5-year plans for industry.
Yes, this crash industrialization drive. There was genuine enthusiasm among some, fueled by massive propaganda about building a socialist utopia, but also immense coercion and suffering. Strikes and unrest were ruthlessly suppressed.
And then the Great Terror.
The purges of the mid to late 1930s. Unimaginable terror. Driven by Stalin's paranoia, fear of opposition, desire for total control. Millions arrested, executed, sent to the Gulag. It decimated the party itself, the military leadership, intellectuals, ordinary citizens. Based on denunciations, forced confessions, the idea of objective guilt.
And history was rewritten again.
Constantly. Stalin manipulated history for propaganda, rehabilitating czarist figures like Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great when needed, emphasizing national unity against foreign threats, like in Eisenstein's film Alexander Nevsky, made just before the war.
Speaking of the war, World War II.
Initially, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, allowing Soviet expansion. Then the devastating German invasion in 1941. The scale of suffering on the Eastern Front was just immense.
The Great Patriotic War narrative.
Became the absolute cornerstone of Soviet and later Russian identity. Shared sacrifice, heroic resistance, ultimate victory, but at a cost of tens of millions of lives. And the Soviet advance pushed communism into Eastern Europe.
Did the end of the war bring relaxation?
Not really. The late Stalin years saw renewed repression, campaigns against cosmopolitanism, targeting Jews. Stalin's death in 1953 led to a power struggle.
And Khrushchev's de-Stalinization.
Yes, his secret speech in 1956 denounced Stalin's crimes. It led to a partial thaw, release of some prisoners, publication of works like Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. But the fundamental system remained.
Khrushchev didn't last, though.
No, he was ousted in 1964, partly seen as erratic. Brezhnev took over, ushering in a long period often called the era of stagnation.
Stability, but also decline.
Apparent stability, yes. But beneath the surface, economic problems grew, cynicism spread, dissent continued, and interestingly, various forms of nationalism, including Russian nationalism, began to reemerge more openly.
Until Gorbachev tried to reform the system.
Right, mid-1980s. Glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He wanted to revitalize socialism, but opening things up unleashed forces he couldn't control.
National movements, calls for independence.
Exactly. In the Baltic states, Ukraine, Georgia, communist hardliners resisted, leading to the failed August coup in 1991.
Which sealed the Soviet Union's fate.
It collapsed by the end of that year, a pivotal moment in world history.
Leading into the chaotic post-Soviet years under Yeltsin.
A difficult transition. Economic shock therapy, the rise of the oligarchs, political instability. Yeltsin eventually chose Vladimir Putin, a relatively unknown former KGB officer, as his successor.
And Putin brought a different vision.
A very different one. After the ideological collapse of the 90s, there was a search for a new Russian identity. Putin offered a vision based on restoring state power, national pride, and a particular interpretation of history.
How did he use history?
He promoted a unified, state-centric narrative. Abolishing elections for regional governors, centralizing control, the Kremlin actively worked to restore pride in Soviet history, especially the World War II victory, framing it as Russia's unique achievement against foreign enemies.
Laws against rehabilitating Nazism.
Used quite broadly to suppress alternative historical viewpoints, especially regarding the war or Soviet actions in Eastern Europe. The narrative became one of Russia as a great power, constantly besieged or undermined by the West and internal enemies, but always restored by strong leaders like himself.
Tapping into that historical sense of grievance or being misunderstood by the West.
Very much so. Russia's long, ambivalent relationship with Europe, wanting to be part of it, but also feeling rejected or different, that's a powerful undercurrent. Putin's anti-Western ideology resonated with many who felt humiliated or left behind after the Soviet collapse.
NATO expansion seen as a provocation?
Definitely presented that way. Perceived Western insults, lecturing. It all fed into this narrative. And then there's the concept of the Russian world, the Ruski Mir.
Echoes of older Pan-Slav ideas.
Yes, this idea of a distinct Russian civilization encompassing Russian speakers and those culturally aligned wherever they live.
Which brings us back to Ukraine.
Exactly. In this narrative, Ukraine is seen as an inseparable part of that Russian world, historically, culturally, religiously, not truly sovereign or separate.
Justifying the 2014 annexation of Crimea.
Framed as protecting Russian speakers, reclaiming historically Russian land, and the current full-scale war is presented by the Kremlin as essentially an existential fight to defend this Russian world against Western encroachment via Ukraine.
Making compromise incredibly difficult.
Extremely difficult when the conflict is framed in these deep, historical, almost civilizational terms. It shows the immense and often dangerous power these historical narratives have when leaders use them to define the present and shape the future.
So tracing this long history, these interwoven narratives, it really does put the current events into a much deeper context, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It doesn't excuse actions, but it helps us understand the viewpoints, the justifications, the deep-seated fears and ambitions that are driving events. Hopefully walking through some of these historical layers provides some clarity.
It highlights how the past is never really past, especially when it's actively used to shape the present. An important takeaway, I think.
Indeed. History is always being contested and reinterpreted.
Well, if you want to keep exploring the complex forces shaping our world, please subscribe so you don't miss future discussions.
And if you found this valuable, perhaps share it with others who are trying to make sense of things.
You can also find links to further resources related to today's topic in the description below.
And most importantly, keep questioning, keep reflecting, and think critically about the narratives presented to you, wherever they come from.